You know that moment right before you're about to sin, that battle in your head. One part of you knows it's wrong, but another part just doesn't care anymore. And then you do it anyway, over and over and over again. Maybe it's looking at what you shouldn't. Maybe it's that addiction you can't stop doing. And every time you fail, you tell yourself, I just need more willpower. I just need to be stronger. But what if I told you that everything you know about self-control is completely wrong? What's interesting about this is that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave us this exact solution 1,400 years ago. But we've been too busy focusing on the wrong things to see it. Look, as Muslims, we're constantly told to just have faith, or just lower your gaze, or just control yourself. But nobody tells you how. Nobody explains what's actually happening in your brain when you're fighting these urges. Today, I'm going to break down the new science of self-control, specifically what researchers discovered about a part of your brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. And more importantly, I'm going to show you exactly how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam built a complete system around this way before science caught up. So, there's this part of your brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. When researchers hooked people up to brain scanners, they discovered something unexpected. Self-control isn't about forcing yourself to do something. It's about how well your brain monitors internal conflict. Think about it. When does self-control actually matter? Only when there's a battle in your head. One part of you wants to sleep through Fajr, another part knows you should wake up. One part wants to look at that haram content, another part knows that you shouldn't. The job of your anterior cingulate cortex is to monitor this battle, and this is where most Muslims mess up. You don't lose control after a long battle of resistance. You lose control the moment you stop monitoring the conflict. The moment you stop paying attention to that battle in your head, it's game over. That's exactly why you can resist something all day and then suddenly give in without even thinking about it. You know how you get super motivated after a Jumu'ah khutbah or a religious video? You make all these plans. This time will be different. But 2 days later, you're back to the same habits. Why? Because motivation doesn't affect your brain's conflict monitoring system at all. The studies are very clear on this. Researchers put people through all kinds of willpower training, cold showers, tough exercises, strict diets, but none of it improved their overall self-control. But do you know what actually worked? Learning to pay attention to their internal conflicts. Just being aware of the battle. This is exactly why you might have incredible self-control in one area, but completely lack it in another. The brother who can fast 18 hours without a problem might not be able to control his anger for 18 seconds. Why? Because self-control isn't a muscle. It's about monitoring specific conflicts in your mind. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam understood this 1,400 years ago. Everything he taught about self-control wasn't about building willpower, it was about building awareness. So, what exactly destroys your self-control? Science discovered 2 major things that completely shut down the conflict monitoring system in your brain. Emotional suppression. This is exactly where most of us go wrong. We try to fight our urges by suppressing them. If you're feeling lustful, just suppress it. If you're feeling angry, suppress it. But here's what happens in your brain. The more emotions you suppress, the worse your self-control gets, and the bigger those emotions grow. Think about it. When do you usually break? When do you actually give in to that sin? It's usually not when you're feeling peaceful. It's when you're emotionally messed up, when you're stressed, angry, lonely, or depressed. The science shows this clearly. The more emotional turbulence you have, the more likely you are to lose control. stress. And this is where modern life is destroying us. Your brain isn't designed to handle 200 notifications a day, constant emails, social media comparisons, family pressure, and money problems. When you're stressed, your brain stops monitoring internal conflict. Why? Because it's too busy dealing with external threats. And this is where most religious advice actually makes things worse. What do we usually hear? You need to feel more guilty about your sins. You need to fear Allah more. You need to think about Jahannam. While these things are true, they add more stress, more emotional turbulence. It literally makes your self-control worse. I'll give you a real example from addiction studies. They found that addicts who feel the most religious guilt about their addiction actually relapse more often. The more shame and guilt they feel, the worse their self-control gets. Why? Because guilt and shame are just more emotional turbulence. And then there's dopamine. Everyone talks about dopamine like it's some kind of evil thing. For example, people say, social media releases dopamine and that's why you're addicted. But that's not how it works. Dopamine isn't about pleasure, it's about anticipation. When you're stressed or emotionally suppressed, your brain craves that dopamine hit even more. That's why you can't stop scrolling when you're stressed. That's why you reach for that haram content when you're feeling down. But Allah gave us a perfect system of self-control through Islam, and the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, showed us how to implement it. A complete system that literally targets your anterior cingulate cortex, the exact part of your brain responsible for self-control. Look at Salah. Notice what you're actually doing 5 times a day. You're forced to break away from everything. You have to do wudu, which science now shows reduces stress and emotional turbulence. Then you stand in prayer. And what happens? You're monitoring your thoughts, your movements, your focus. You're literally training your conflict monitoring system. The timing of Salah is genius. Every few hours, right when your brain starts to lose that monitoring ability, the adhan calls you back. It's a neural reset. Modern productivity experts now tell you to take breaks every 90 to 120 minutes. Then look at fasting. Fasting dramatically improves your brain's conflict monitoring ability. When you're fasting, you're constantly aware of your urges, without suppressing them. You're not fighting the hunger. You are acknowledge it, but choose not to act on it. That's exactly what builds self-control. But here's what most of us miss. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, never meant for us to do this alone. Look at his system of brotherhood. He would pair companions together. Why? Recent studies show that people trying to build self-control alone fail 80% of the time. But with accountability partners, success rates jump to over 70%. There's a famous study where researchers looked at what makes people actually stick to long-term change. You know what the biggest factor was? Not motivation, not willpower. It was their social environment. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, knew this, and that's why he said, "A person is on the religion of their close friend." Think about it. A system where you pray in congregation, break your fast together, and have daily interactions with people on the same path. Modern science is just catching up to what Islam established centuries ago. That environment and community are stronger than individual willpower. The studies back this up. They found that regular meditation, which is basically what Salah is, physically strengthens your anterior cingulate cortex. They found that fasting improves neural pathways related to self-control. They also found that social accountability drastically increases success rates in behavior change. But the thing is, most of us do it wrong. We'll pray, but we skip the community aspect. We fast in Ramadan, but ignore the daily resets of Salah. This system only works when you take it as a complete package. So, I'll give you the real protocol that actually works. No motivational nonsense, just practical steps based on what we've learned. Step 1. Stop trying to force yourself to change everything at once. Your brain's conflict monitoring system gets overwhelmed. Instead, here's what you do. Start with just your 5 daily resets. But, and this is important, don't even worry about perfect prayers yet. Just make sure you're doing wudu and praying something, even if it's basic. Why? Because you're building that monitoring system first. Common mistake number 1, suppressing your urges. When you feel an urge, you need to stop doing that. Instead, when you feel an urge, whether it's to watch something haram, to skip fajr, or whatever it is, just observe it. Don't fight it, don't suppress it, and don't feel guilty about it. Just notice it and say, okay, I'm having this urge right now. This might seem too simple, but it literally strengthens your anterior cingulate cortex. Here's what to expect in your first 30 days. Week 1. You'll probably still mess up a lot. That's normal, but you'll start noticing your triggers more. Week 2. You'll catch yourself before acting on urges. Week 3. This is usually the hardest week. This is when most people relapse. Why? Because your brain starts thinking, I've got this under control now, and stops monitoring. Week 4. This is when real change starts. If you stick with it, you'll notice improvements. Relapses are going to happen, but when people relapse, they often feel guilty and then binge on that sin because they think, I've already messed up anyway. Remember what we learned about guilt and emotional turbulence. Instead, when you relapse, just notice it and say, you know what? I slipped, and that's okay. Then immediately do wudu and pray 2 rak'ahs, not as punishment, but to reset your monitoring system. To make this change permanent, you need 2 things. 1. An accountability partner. Not someone who's going to shame you, but someone who's also trying to improve. 2. A morning routine. Build structure into your day to set the right tone. Lastly, you'll have days when you feel spiritually high and days where you feel nothing. Both are normal. Your job isn't to force feelings. Your job is just to maintain that monitoring system through your 5 daily resets, regardless of how you feel. Look, I know that some of you watching this are feeling hopeless right now. Maybe you've tried to change 100 times. Maybe you've made 1,000 promises to Allah that this time will be different. But I want you to understand something. Your past failures weren't because you're weak. They weren't because you don't have enough iman. And they weren't even because you don't have enough willpower. They were because you were fighting against your brain's natural wiring instead of working with it. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave us a complete system that perfectly matches what science has now discovered about self-control. He didn't tell us to just try harder or feel more guilty. He gave us 5 daily resets to maintain our monitoring system, a fasting protocol that builds awareness, a brotherhood system for accountability, and most importantly, a way to change without destroying ourselves with guilt. So here's what I want you to do right now. 1. Start with just your 5 daily resets. 2. Find one person you can improve with. 3. Stop trying to suppress your emotions. 4. Remember, the goal isn't perfection. The goal is awareness. If you found value from this video, make sure like, share, and subscribe this channel for more valuable content.